I never expected a thunderstorm to change the way I looked at my best friend. If you had asked me that morning what the most memorable part of our weekend would be, I would have said the fishing trip, the barbecue, or George embarrassing himself trying to build a campfire. I definitely wouldn't have guessed that a single night, trapped inside an old cabin, while the rain pounded against the roof, would stay with me long after the storm had passed. My name is Alexander, and George had been my closest friend for almost 5 years. We met during our first semester at college after getting paired together for a group project that neither of us wanted. Somehow we went from complaining about deadlines to spending almost every weekend together. We watched games, played video games until 2 in the morning, helped each other move apartments, and called whenever life got overwhelming. He was the kind of friend everyone wanted, confident without showing off, funny without trying too hard, the sort of guy who could walk into any room and make people feel comfortable within minutes. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed he was attractive. I noticed. I just never let myself think about it for very long. George dated women, talked about women, and as far as I knew, he'd never questioned that part of himself. So whatever small crush I developed over the years stayed exactly where it belonged, locked away, where it couldn't ruin the best friendship I'd ever had. When George suggested renting a small cabin outside town for the weekend, I agreed immediately. We both need a break, he said over the phone. No work, no emails, just 2 days doing absolutely nothing. I can get behind that. And I already booked it. You booked it before asking me? I knew you'd say yes. He wasn't wrong. The drive there took almost 3 hours. George spent most of it singing badly to old rock songs while I laughed at how confidently he missed every high note. You know, I said, shaking my head, it's actually impressive that you're this off-key. It's called personality. It's called attacking music. He grinned without taking his eyes off the road. You still came with me. I didn't have much choice. Liar. Maybe I was. Because the truth was, spending a quiet weekend with George sounded better than anything else I'd had planned. The cabin sat beside a small lake surrounded by tall pine trees. It wasn't fancy, but it had a wide porch, a stone fireplace, and just enough distance from the nearest road to make the whole place feel peaceful. This is perfect, George said as he stretched his arms overhead. For the first few hours, everything felt exactly the way we'd imagined. We unpacked, cooked burgers outside, walked along the lake while joking about old college memories. The sky stayed bright, and the air carried that crisp smell that only seemed to exist in the woods. Then, sometime after dinner, I noticed the clouds. Dark, heavy, moving much faster than they should have. George followed my eyes toward the horizon. That doesn't look good. A low rumble echoed through the trees. 5 minutes later, another one came, much louder this time. The wind picked up without warning, bending the branches overhead. We should probably get inside, George said. The first raindrops hit the porch just as we reached the front door. Within minutes, the quiet evening disappeared beneath sheets of rain and flashes of lightning that turned the entire forest white for a split second before plunging everything back into darkness. Neither of us knew it yet. But before the night was over, the storm outside would become the least confusing thing either of us had to face. The rain only got worse. By 9 that night, the lake had completely disappeared behind a gray curtain of water, and the wind shook the cabin hard enough to make the windows rattle. George stood in front of one of them with his arms crossed. I don't think I've ever seen it come down this hard. Another flash of lightning lit up the room. Almost immediately, thunder crashed so loudly that it made both of us jump. Okay, I laughed nervously. That one was close. George looked over his shoulder. You all right? Yeah. You sure? I shrugged. I've never really liked thunderstorms. That wasn't entirely true. I hated them. Ever since I was a kid, loud storms made me anxious. I never talked about it because it always felt childish. Adults weren't supposed to get nervous because of thunder. George didn't laugh. Instead, he nodded like I'd told him something completely normal. Good thing we're inside, then. We spent the next hour trying to ignore the weather. We played cards, cooked frozen pizza in the tiny oven, argued about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. It absolutely does, George insisted. It absolutely doesn't. You have terrible taste. I have standards. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his slice. The easy conversation helped. For a while, I almost forgot how violently the storm was beating against the cabin. Then everything went black. The lights died. The refrigerator went silent. The television blinked off. Only the sound of rain remained. Well, George said after a second, I guess nature made today's decision for us. You think the power's out everywhere? Probably. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The warm beam bounced across the wooden walls. I saw candles in one of the kitchen drawers. We found 3. George lit them one by one, and suddenly the entire cabin looked different. Smaller, warmer, almost cozy. Outside, lightning continued flashing through the windows, but inside, the soft candlelight made everything feel strangely peaceful. Until my phone buzzed. No signal. George checked his. Same here. So we're officially stuck, he smiled. I have been stuck with worse people. That's surprisingly nice. Don't get used to it. Don't. I rolled my eyes. For another hour, we talked about everything. College memories, bad dates, jobs we'd hated, future plans. At some point, George leaned back on the couch and looked toward the ceiling. You ever think about how weird it is? What? 5 years. What about them? Our friendship. I looked at him. It doesn't feel like 5. No. He smiled to himself. It feels longer. In a bad way? In a comfortable way. That answer caught me off guard. George wasn't usually sentimental. I don't say it enough, he continued quietly, but I'm glad we're friends. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I'm glad too. He looked over at me. I mean it, Alex. Nobody had called me Alex in years except him. Most people used Alexander. For some reason, hearing my nickname in that moment made my chest tighten. I don't know where I'd be without you. I laughed softly. Probably still getting lost every time you use GPS. Hey, it's true. I have an incredible sense of direction. You once drove 40 minutes the wrong way. That road was misleading. The road had signs. He threw one of the couch pillows at me. I caught it, laughing. Then another explosion of thunder cracked directly overhead. This time I flinched hard enough that George noticed. He didn't tease me. Didn't even smile. You really hate storms. I looked away. Yeah. There was a pause. My parents used to leave me alone during them. The words slipped out before I could stop them. George stayed quiet. When I was 10, I continued, staring into the candle flame. They both worked night shifts for a while. Every time there was a storm, I'd sit in my room pretending I wasn't scared. You never told me that. I know. Another flash lit the room. George's expression softened. You don't have to pretend tonight. For some reason, that simple sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Like he actually meant it. Like if the storm lasted all night, he'd stay awake with me without complaining. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees. Inside, the silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt different. Neither of us realized it yet, but something had quietly begun to change between us, long before either of us found the courage to admit it. The cabin felt smaller after midnight. Maybe it was because the storm hadn't let up for hours, or maybe it was because the silence between each clap of thunder had become almost unbearable. Every time the lightning flashed, the walls glowed white for a second before fading back into the soft light of the candles. George stood by the front door. I'm going to make sure everything outside is secure. You don't have to. If the chairs blow away, the owner will probably charge us. I sighed. Fine, but don't stay out there long. He grabbed a rain jacket from the hook by the door and flashed me a grin. I'll survive. The second he opened the door, the wind shoved it backward. Rain sprayed across the wooden floor. Damn, he muttered. I watched from inside as he hurried across the porch, grabbing 2 lightweight chairs before they could tip over. The rain soaked him almost instantly. His hair was plastered to his forehead by the time he dragged everything against the wall and hurried back. He slammed the door shut behind him. Mission accomplished, I couldn't help laughing. You look like you jumped into the lake. I practically did. He peeled off the soaked jacket and wrung water from the sleeves into the sink. Guess I underestimated that storm. No kidding. He disappeared down the hallway. I'm going to change before I freeze. A few minutes later, he came back wearing gray sweatpants and an old navy hoodie I'd seen him wear dozens of times over the years. His damp hair curled slightly at the front, making him look younger somehow. You've been staring for like 5 seconds, he said with a smirk. I was wondering if you owned anything besides hoodies. I own 2 hoodies. Oh, my mistake, he laughed. You hungry again? Always. We found marshmallows in one of the kitchen cabinets and ended up roasting them over the fireplace using metal skewers we discovered in a drawer. I can't believe this actually works, I said. George took a bite. Needs chocolate. And graham crackers. So basically everything? Exactly. For a while, it almost felt like we were kids hiding from the weather. No phones, no internet, no distractions, just the crackling fire and the sound of rain beating against the roof. Then the cabin shook. Not violently, just enough to make both of us stop talking. Another crack of thunder followed almost immediately, closer than before. My stomach tightened. George noticed. Without saying anything, he moved from the armchair to the couch beside me. Not right next to me, just closer. You okay? I will be. He nodded. You know. What? My grandmother used to count. I looked over. Count? She'd count the seconds between lightning and thunder. I remember learning that. She always said counting gave your brain something else to focus on. Another flash lit the room. George started counting quietly. 1. His voice was calm. 2. The thunder arrived before he reached 4. He smiled. Still pretty close. I found myself smiling too. The next few flashes we counted together. It was stupid. Simple. But somehow it helped. Around 1 in the morning, the rain became even heavier. The roof groaned under the constant pounding. Then another sound joined it. Tap, tap, tap. George frowned. You hear that? The tapping came again, from somewhere outside. Not loud, just steady. He grabbed the flashlight. I'll check. I'll come with you. We stepped onto the covered porch. The rain was cold enough to sting. George swept the flashlight across the yard. Nothing. Then he pointed upward. There. A loose tree branch had blown against the roof, scraping it every time the wind shifted. I let out a relieved breath. I thought it was something worse. George chuckled. You've watched too many horror movies. We stood there for another minute, looking out across the lake. Or where the lake should have been. The darkness swallowed everything beyond the first few trees. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing the water for a heartbeat before it vanished again. It's actually beautiful, George said quietly. It is. The rain soaked the edge of the porch, but neither of us hurried back inside. The air smelled fresh, cold, clean. George rested his forearms on the railing. You know what I like about storms? What? They remind you how small everything else is. I looked at him. What do you mean? We spend so much time stressing over work, money, deadlines. He shrugged. Then something like this happens. Another flash split the sky, and suddenly all that matters is whether the roof stays on. I laughed softly. When did you become philosophical? I'm sleep deprived. I was going to say dramatic. That too. The wind picked up again. Without thinking, I stepped a little closer to avoid the rain blowing sideways. Our shoulders brushed. Neither of us moved away. For several long seconds, we simply stood there watching the storm roll across the lake. It should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt comfortable, safer than I'd expected. George finally glanced toward me. You know something? What? I'm glad I didn't come here alone. I smiled. Me too. Neither of us realized that those simple words carried far more meaning than either of us was ready to admit. By the time we went back inside, it was almost 2 in the morning. The storm hadn't weakened. If anything, it sounded even angrier. George locked the front door behind us before adding another log to the fireplace. And we're definitely not getting much sleep tonight. Probably not. He stretched, letting out a yawn. I'll make some hot chocolate. You seriously packed hot chocolate? He looked offended. Alexander, we're in a cabin. Hot chocolate is basically mandatory. I laughed. I stand corrected. A few minutes later, we were sitting on the couch with steaming mugs warming our hands. Outside, another blast of thunder rolled across the sky. This time, I didn't jump as much. George noticed. Getting used to it? I think I'm getting used to having company. His smile was small but genuine. I'll take that as a compliment. You should. For a while, we simply watched the fire. Neither of us felt the need to fill every silence anymore. That had always been one of the things I appreciated about George. We could sit together for half an hour without speaking, and it never felt uncomfortable. Eventually, he broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Sure. When was your last relationship? I looked into my mug. Almost 2 years. What happened? It just wasn't right. He nodded slowly. You never really talked about him. I didn't want to. George accepted that answer without pushing. After a moment, he chuckled quietly. I've had exactly one serious relationship. I remember. Disaster. You dated for almost a year. Longest year of my life. I smiled. You two argued a lot. We argued about everything. He leaned back against the couch. I kept trying to be someone I wasn't. What do you mean? I thought being in a relationship meant changing myself to make the other person happy. He shrugged. It doesn't work. I found myself studying his face in the firelight. You've changed since then. I know. For the better. George looked at me for a second longer than usual. Thanks. The room fell quiet again. Then another loud crack echoed overhead. Almost immediately afterward, the lights flickered. I frowned. I thought the power was already out. It was. The overhead light flashed once, twice, then disappeared again. George laughed. The cabin can't decide. Before I could answer, another gust slammed into the side of the building hard enough to make the windows shake. Instinctively, I grabbed the edge of the couch. George looked toward me. You okay? Yeah. But I wasn't convincing. He set his mug down on the coffee table. Come here. I blinked. What? Come here. I hesitated. George opened one arm with a small smile. I mean, unless you're planning on wrestling the thunder by yourself. I laughed despite myself. You make that sound ridiculous. Because it is. Another deafening crash interrupted us. Without really thinking, I shifted closer. George draped an arm loosely around my shoulders. Not tightly, not awkwardly. Just enough that I could feel the steady warmth of his hoodie. You know, he said quietly, when I was little, my older brother used to do this. You have a brother? Half-brother. You've never mentioned him. We're not close anymore. His voice carried a sadness I'd never heard before. When storms scared me, he'd tell me they always passed. I stared into the flames. And did they? Eventually? Another silence settled between us. This one felt different, more personal. I became aware of everything at once. The warmth from the fireplace, the smell of wood smoke, the rhythm of George's breathing, the weight of his arm resting naturally around me. None of it felt forced. If anything, it felt strangely familiar, like we'd skipped over an invisible line neither of us realized we'd been approaching for years. George spoke so quietly I almost missed it. You've always been there for me. I turned my head. So have you. No. He shook his head. I mean, really there. I frowned. What are you talking about? The year my dad got sick. My chest tightened. I remembered. George had practically disappeared for months. Hospital visits, work, stress, Fear. I don't think I ever thanked you. You don't have to. I do. He looked down at the floor. You showed up every single time I called. That's what friends do. I know. His voice grew softer. But not everyone actually does it. Outside, lightning flashed again. This time, neither of us looked toward the window. We were looking at each other instead. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The storm still raged around the cabin, but somehow, it no longer felt like the loudest thing in the room. I don't know how long we sat there. The fire had burned lower, leaving behind glowing embers that filled the cabin with a soft orange light. The storm still rolled overhead, but the thunder had become less frequent, settling into a distant rhythm. George finally let out a slow breath. I think it's calming down. A little. Neither of us moved away. His arm was still around my shoulders, resting there so naturally that it almost felt strange to think about it. If someone had told me that morning I'd end up sitting like this with George, I would have laughed. Now, I wasn't laughing. I was trying very hard not to think about how comfortable I felt. George glanced at me. You know what I'm realizing? What? We've known each other for 5 years. Yeah. And I still don't know everything about you. I smiled faintly. I'm not that interesting. That's where you're wrong. He shifted slightly so he could face me better. Tell me something nobody else knows. I looked down at my mug. That's a dangerous question. Exactly. I thought for a long moment. Then I laughed quietly. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a firefighter. George blinked. Seriously? I was 6. I can actually picture that. What about you? He leaned back, smiling to himself. I wanted to be a pilot. What happened? I found out I hate flying. I laughed. That would complicate things. A little. The easy conversation returned, but it felt different now. More open, less guarded, like we had both quietly decided to stop pretending we had everything figured out. After another few minutes, George became unusually quiet. You ever wonder why some people stay in your life? I looked over. What do you mean? There are people you meet for years. He stared into the fireplace. And then there are people who somehow become family. The word lingered in the room. Family. I've never really had many close friends, he admitted. I know. You've probably been the closest person I've had since college. I swallowed. You've been mine too. George looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not surprised, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. I don't think I tell you that enough. You don't have to. I know. He smiled faintly. But I probably should. A sudden flash of lightning lit the room. This time the thunder came several seconds later, farther away. The storm really was moving on. George looked toward the window. Looks like it's finally leaving. I followed his gaze. Yeah. For some reason, instead of feeling relieved, I felt disappointed. It didn't make sense. I'd wanted the storm to end for hours, so why did it suddenly feel like something else was ending too? George stood and stretched. I should probably check if the bedrooms are warming up. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, each with a double bed. When he came back a minute later, he rubbed the back of his neck. Bad news. What? The window in the second bedroom isn't sealing properly. So? It's freezing in there. I frowned. What about your room? Mine's fine. He hesitated. Actually, what? The bed's bigger than I remembered. I looked at him. He quickly raised both hands. I'm not making this weird. I know. I'm just saying, it seems kind of pointless for one of us to sleep in an icebox. I couldn't help smiling. You're terrible at making suggestions. I've noticed. So you're asking me to share the bed. I'm asking if you want to stay warm. He waited, giving me every chance to say no. Instead, I surprised both of us. Okay. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Okay? Yeah. You sure? I trust you. The words came out before I could rethink them. George's expression softened. Thanks. A few minutes later, we finished cleaning up the living room and carried the candles into the bedroom. The bed really was larger than I'd expected, still close enough that we'd definitely notice each other. George chuckled awkwardly. This suddenly feels like we're 12 years old at a sleepover. I laughed. It kinda does. He pulled an extra blanket from the closet and tossed it onto the mattress. There. We survived the storm, without freezing to death. Exactly. We climbed into bed on opposite sides, leaving as much space between us as possible. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The rain continued tapping gently against the roof. Not violently anymore, just enough to remind us it was still there. George turned off the flashlight, leaving only the candle flickering on the nightstand. Alexander? Yeah? I'm glad you came this weekend. I smiled into the darkness. I'm glad you asked. Silence returned. Comfortable. Peaceful. Then, somewhere outside, another crack of thunder echoed across the lake, much quieter than before, almost distant. Neither of us flinched. Neither of us realized that by morning the storm would no longer be the thing either of us remembered most about that weekend. I didn't fall asleep right away. The room was quiet except for the soft tapping of rain against the window and the occasional crack from the fireplace still glowing in the next room. George was lying on the other side of the bed, facing the ceiling. You awake? He asked quietly. Yeah, I figured. You too. He chuckled. My brain won't shut off. I smiled into the darkness. Mine neither. For a while we simply listened to the rain. It sounded different now. Gentler. Almost calming. George finally broke the silence. Can I ask you something? You've already asked that twice tonight. I know. This one's different. I turned onto my side to face him. Go ahead. He hesitated much longer than I expected. Have you ever been afraid to tell someone how you really felt? The question caught me completely off guard. Yeah? Because you thought it would ruin everything? I swallowed. More than once. He nodded slowly. I know that feeling. The room fell silent again. I wanted to ask who he meant. I wanted to ask when. Instead, I stayed quiet. Somehow it felt like he wasn't finished. George stared at the ceiling. My dad always told me that the biggest regrets in life come from the things you never say. You believe that? I didn't. He let out a slow breath. I think I do now. Lightning flashed faintly through the curtains. The storm had moved farther away. The thunder followed almost 10 seconds later. Barely a rumble. George smiled. Looks like it's finally over. It is. Neither of us mentioned that neither of us had gone to sleep. Eventually, he rolled onto his side until we were facing each other across the small space between us. The candle had almost burned out. Its soft glow barely illuminated his face. I've been thinking about something all night, he admitted. What? You. My heart skipped. Me? He nodded. I kept wondering why being here with you feels so easy. I searched his face. We've always been close. I know. But this feels different. Neither of us looked away. For the first time since we'd arrived at the cabin, I realized George looked just as nervous as I felt. He gave a quiet laugh. I've rehearsed saying something for almost an hour. What is it? He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't actually know where to start. Try the beginning. He smiled. You always say that. Because it works. He looked down at the blanket before meeting my eyes again. I think somewhere along the way, he paused. You stopped feeling like just my best friend. My breath caught. The words hung between us. Neither of us moved. Neither of us seemed able to. I didn't expect it, he continued quietly. I fought it. His laugh was nervous now. I kept telling myself I was just confused. I could barely find my voice. George, I don't know exactly what this means yet. He shook his head. I only know that tonight made pretending impossible. For several long seconds, all I could do was stare at him. Then I laughed softly, not because it was funny, because the relief hit me all at once. I thought I was the only one. His eyebrows lifted. What? I've cared about you for a long time. I looked away, embarrassed. I just never believed I had any reason to tell you. George stared at me in complete silence. You... I figured you were straight. I thought I was. He laughed weakly. Or maybe I just never met someone who made me question anything. The room felt impossibly still. So we've both been hiding this? He nodded. For years, apparently. I couldn't help smiling. That's kind of ridiculous. It really is. We both laughed quietly. Not because the situation was simple, because it finally wasn't a secret anymore. George looked at me with the same warmth I'd seen 1,000 times before. Only now I understood it differently. Can I do something? He asked softly. What? I'm gonna hug you. I smiled. You don't have to ask. He moved closer, slowly enough that I could have stopped him. I didn't. His arms wrapped around me gently. I hugged him back without hesitation. No rush, no uncertainty, just the quiet comfort of finally being honest with each other. Outside, the last distant rumble of thunder faded beyond the hills. The storm that had kept us awake all night was finally gone, but neither of us wanted to let go. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a long time. We just stayed there, holding each other while the cabin settled into complete silence. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I couldn't hear thunder at all. George was the first to pull back, not because he wanted to, just enough that he could look at me. So, he said with a nervous smile, I guess we really weren't imagining all those weird moments. I laughed softly. No. You noticed them too? Every single one. He raised an eyebrow. Like what? I shook my head. You really want to know? I've waited 5 years. I can wait another 30 seconds. I smiled. Remember that concert last summer? The outdoor one? You kept putting your hand on my shoulder every time the crowd pushed. George chuckled. I told myself I was just making sure you didn't get knocked over. Were you? He hesitated. Maybe at first. And after that, he looked at me with a sheepish grin. I just liked having an excuse. I felt my face grow warm. My turn. Go ahead. The night I was sick with the flu. I immediately remembered. I brought you soup. You stayed until I fell asleep. You would have done the same for me. I know. He smiled gently. But I remember waking up once. You were still sitting in the chair. I blinked. You were awake. For about 10 seconds. You should have told me. I liked knowing you were there. His words settled over me like a blanket. There had been so many moments. Tiny ones. The kind that never seemed important at the time. Now they all fit together. George leaned back against the headboard. You know what's funny? What? I spent years trying to convince myself I was protecting our friendship. I did the same. And meanwhile, we were both miserable. He laughed. When you say it like that, it sounds pretty dumb. It really does. Morning sunlight slowly began filtering through the curtains. I hadn't even realized how close dawn was. George noticed too. We stayed up all night. I guess we did. He looked toward the window. The storm's gone. I followed his gaze. The clouds had broken apart, revealing streaks of pale blue sky. Everything outside looked freshly washed. Water clung to the pine trees, and the lake reflected the first hints of sunrise. It looks completely different. George stood and walked to the window. Come here. I joined him. The porch, the trees, even the muddy path leading toward the lake seemed brighter than they had the day before. It almost doesn't feel real, I said. He nodded. Last night felt like everything was falling apart. And now? He looked at me instead of the view. Now it feels like everything finally makes sense. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then George reached for my hand, slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. Instead, I slipped my fingers into his. It felt natural, almost surprising in how natural it felt. He smiled down at our hands before looking back at me. I don't want to rush this. I don't either. I don't even know what we're calling this. We don't have to figure it out today. He seemed relieved. Thank you. We've got time. He nodded. As long as we're honest this time. No more pretending. No more pretending. A little later, we stepped outside. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles. Small drops of water still fell from the branches whenever the breeze picked up. George took a deep breath. I forgot how good everything smells after rain. I laughed. I think you're just happy the cabin's still standing. That too. We wandered down to the edge of the lake, careful not to slip in the mud. The water was perfectly still now, like the storm had never happened. George skipped a flat stone across the surface. It bounced 4 times before disappearing. You always beat me at this, I said. Years of practice. Years of... I found a stone of my own. Mine bounced once and sank immediately. George burst out laughing. That was tragic. I'd like to see you do better. I literally just did. I shoved his shoulder lightly. He grinned and nudged me back. The playful ease between us hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt stronger. Nothing about him seemed unfamiliar. He was still George, still the guy who laughed too loudly at terrible jokes, sang off-key in the car, and insisted pineapple belonged on pizza. The only difference was that neither of us had to hide anymore. As we started walking back toward the cabin, George slowed beside me. Alexander? Yeah? I'm really glad there was a storm. I looked at him smiling. I never thought I'd hear anyone say that. Neither did I. He squeezed my hand gently. But if it hadn't happened... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I already knew. The drive home felt completely different from the drive there. 2 days earlier, George and I had spent most of the trip arguing about music, joking about getting lost, and making fun of each other's coffee orders. Now, neither of us knew exactly what to say. Not because things were awkward, because everything had changed. George rested one hand on the steering wheel, while the other tapped lightly against his leg in time with the music playing quietly through the speakers. After nearly 20 minutes of silence, he glanced over. You okay? I smiled. Yeah. You've got that thinking face. I have a thinking face? You've had it for 5 years. I laughed. I was just wondering what happens now. He nodded slowly. I've been wondering the same thing. The road stretched ahead, still damp from the night storm. I don't want us to pretend none of this happened, I admitted. I don't either. But I know. Real life wasn't a quiet cabin tucked away beside a lake. Real life meant work, friends, family, questions neither of us had answers to yet. George finally spoke. Can I make one promise? Sure. No matter how confusing this gets. He looked at me for a second before returning his eyes to the road. I don't want to lose you. I didn't even hesitate. You won't. You mean that? I've meant it for years. A small smile spread across his face. So have I. When we reached my apartment building, neither of us moved to get out of the car. The engine was off. The music had stopped, yet we stayed there. George laughed quietly. I think we're both trying to delay this. Maybe. He looked at me. I'd normally hug you goodbye. So would I. But I kind of want to kiss you. My heart skipped. He immediately added, only if you want to. I smiled before he could finish another sentence. I do. He leaned over the center console slowly, carefully, giving me every chance to change my mind. Instead, I met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, short, almost hesitant, almost. Neither dramatic nor perfect, just honest. When we pulled apart, George laughed under his breath. What? I've wanted to do that for a long time. You picked a terrible place. He looked around the apartment parking lot. Fair point. I laughed. Next time? His smile grew. Somewhere with less chance of my neighbor walking by. I can agree to that. Before I got out of the car, he reached over and squeezed my hand. Dinner tomorrow? Is this a date? He pretended to think. I was hoping you'd call it that. It sounds nice. It does. The next evening we met at the small Italian restaurant we'd visited dozens of times as friends. Nothing about the place had changed. Same owner, same booths, same menu. Yet everything felt new. When I walked in, George was already waiting. He stood as soon as he saw me. You look nice, I laughed. I changed shirts 3 times. I changed 4. That made both of us laugh. Some of the nervousness disappeared immediately. Over dinner we talked, really talked, not just about what had happened at the cabin, but about what we wanted moving forward. Neither of us wanted to rush. Neither of us wanted to pretend we suddenly had every answer. We agreed on one thing. Whatever this became, we wanted to build it the same way we'd built our friendship, with honesty, patience, and showing up for each other. The weeks that followed felt surprisingly natural. We started going on actual dates. Some were planned, others happened by accident. Coffee after work became long walks through the park. Movie night somehow ended with us talking until 2 in the morning. Our friends noticed something before we ever said a word. One afternoon, our mutual friend Max watched George hand me the last slice of pizza without even asking. He narrowed his eyes. Okay. George looked up. What? I've known you both for years. So? You two are smiling at each other way too much. Neither of us answered. Max pointed between us. I knew it. George blinked. Knew what? I didn't know when. He folded his arms with a grin. But I knew eventually one of you idiots would figure it out. I couldn't stop laughing. You really knew? You've been acting like an old married couple since college. George looked at me. Were we that obvious? Apparently. A month later, we went back to the lake. Not because another storm was coming, because the weather forecast promised clear skies. The cabin looked exactly the same. Only this time, sunshine reflected off the water instead of lightning. George stood on the porch and smiled. Feels smaller. Maybe because we're not hiding from the weather. He nodded. Maybe. We walked down to the shoreline where we'd stood that morning after the storm. The lake was calm enough to mirror the clouds. George slipped his hand into mine. I've been thinking. Dangerous, he laughed. It usually is. Then he grew serious. You know that promise I made? Which one? That I didn't want to lose you. I remember. I think I left something out. What? He looked directly into my eyes. I don't just want you in my life because you're my best friend anymore. My heart beat a little faster. I want to build a future with you. I smiled before I even realized I was. You know? What? I was hoping you'd say that. He laughed. I've spent enough years waiting. So have I. He wrapped his arms around me, and this time I held him without fear, without hesitation, and without wondering what it meant. Because now I knew. Sometimes the biggest moments in life don't happen during perfect sunsets or carefully planned occasions. Sometimes they happen during power outages, sleepless nights, and storms that force you to stop running from the truth. Looking back, I barely remember how loud the thunder was. I don't remember how many hours the rain lasted. What I remember is one simple moment. The moment my best friend quietly moved closer on the couch, wrapped an arm around my shoulders, and made me realize that home wasn't a place at all. It was the person who chose to stay beside me when the storm was at its worst. And from that weekend on, neither of us ever faced another storm alone.